What the hell? It's JLL, that Gnostic teacher on the internet. I'm still here, still delivering the message of Sophianic Gnosis. It's December 20th of 2017, and I'm here today to talk about Zadakim, the Nazis, and the master race ideology behind AI. Now, this talk is current with the theme I've been developing for a couple of weeks now, triggered initially by the phenomenon of the AI robot Sophia. Someone pointed out to me in the comments that the phonemes contained in Sophia resonate to the word fia, or fear. I would point out that the phonemes in the word Sophia, which is the correct pronunciation along Gnostic lines, resonate and rhyme with the word desire. Desire is an element of the Sophianic teaching, an element of planetary tantra. So what is stronger, desire or fear? Well, desire, as I pointed out in the last talk, desire is a deal breaker here. What you're being told about the advancement of robotic technology and the future in which AI, which is a product of the human mind, becomes superior to the human intelligence that created it. All that you're being told about that, including the claim that, 40% of the workforce, where? In the Western world, let's say? 40% of the workforce, 40% of the jobs performed now will be performed by robots by the year 2030 or 2040 or whatever. You've heard these claims. All of that is mental warfare directed at you, and emotional warfare to make you afraid, to give you the message that you're being phased out. You, as human species, are slated for termination, and your work, the opportunity to work and thereby give dignity to your life and have a role in the social order, is being taken away from you. And the point I make about all that jazz is that your very desire to live is being attacked by those who are behind Sophia and the ideology of AI, which I now identify with the ideology of the master race program that originated with the Zadak. So I'm going to continue in that vein, and doing so this time, if I can switch screens, I'm going to respond in part to a comment that came up on my last talk from Femi Alchemy, who's been writing me for a long time, and I must say I'm happy that I still am in contact over these many years, must be like 7 or 8 years now. Zadakim, as in League of Just Men, who commissioned Karl Rabison Marx to write Commie Manifesto, ? BTW, Ford-Hitler connection has more parts, more like a Zad-managed dialectic, with manned leading Nazis as Zads. Presumably that refers to Mandela. Not acceptable for any analysis to omit Anthony Sutton's and Carol Quigley's work. Let's also tune attention to the Zads who pretend to be royals, like the German and Brit elites, so intermarried you can't tell a royal who from a you-know-who. We'd rather think the Zads co-emerge in his story with the Brahmins, same mentality, about same time, same untouchable shit. So, who or what is common source of both master race ideologies, and can we discern an archontic infection in Brahmanism's biophobia? Brilliant comment, great questions. Now, I can't take that apart and answer it completely in this talk. I can't address the question of Brahmanism right now, except to say that the association of the rise of Brahmanism and the rise of the Abrahamic archontic infection historically as parallels is a good one. It's a valuable one and certainly deserves investigation. What I am going to address is the question of master race ideology. Now, when anyone today hears the term master race ideology, where does your mind go? Those evil Germans, right? The Nazis, Hitler, that was the master race ideology. Why does your mind go there? You know, your mind goes to the Germans and the Nazis when you hear that cue, exactly like a dog salivates when a bell rings in the Pavlovian experiment. You have been mind controlled to bring your attention directly and exclusively upon the phenomena of the Third Reich and the Nazi Party, that is to say, the National Socialist Workers' Party, NASDAQ. Your attention goes there because you and I and all of us, everyone in the world, has been conditioned. Someone has conditioned you by a mind control programming to do that, to take your attention to that phenomenon. And in fact, the claim that the Nazis and Hitler and the Third Reich operated on a master race ideology is false and not supported by evidence. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to give you some evidence about MRI, let's call it MRI, master race ideology, that you perhaps haven't seen before. This evidence relates intimately to some of the points I raised and the clues and cues that I developed in the course of the Gnostic investigation of the Mandela effect. In particular, I'll take you back to the vampire cluster. Okay, the vampire cluster. Remember that? There were three main clusters of clues in the Mandela effect investigation. Also, I'd like to say, in direct response to this comment, sure, I follow Anthony Sutton's work. Now, Anthony Sutton pointed out that capitalists funded the communist revolution in Russia. It should not be called the communist revolution, by the way. More correctly, the Bolshevik takeover of the revolutionary movements in Russia that had been germinating through the late 19th century and broke forth in the early 20th century. There were revolutionary currents, revolutionary trends in Russia. And those trends were hijacked by the Bolsheviks. So Anthony Sutton shows that the Bolshevik takeover of those revolutionary movements in Russia was funded and directed by capitalist bankers who were, for the most part, Xenosh, such as the Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, and so forth, and so on. Also, I would have you notice that in one of his interviews, correct me if I'm wrong on this, by the way, but in one of Anthony Sutton's interviews, after having established this extremely important connection between Wall Street and the communist movement, he was confronted directly with the question of how much of the funding of the Third Reich came from that same network, that is to say, from the Jewish banking mafia. And as far as I know, Anthony Sutton averred on that question. That is to say, he did not directly answer that question. Now, you will find on the internet a lot of people saying that the Nazis were funded by the Rothschilds, that Hitler was backed by Jewish money. You will also find, if you look carefully, certain researchers and investigators, such as Carolyn Yeager, who refute that claim or who qualify it very carefully. It's not to say that there was no Jewish money involved in the banking transactions, the complex banking transactions that supported the Nazi Party. It would have been impossible to do anything at that time without some involvement with the Jewish banking network. But bear in mind that the principal thing that Adolf Hitler did that turned around the German economy was to exclude the Jewish bankers and establish currency that was issued by the state, issued by the nation state, and not issued from the central banking system of the Jewish mafia and the Rothschilds. So it's my understanding that although there was some involvement with that Jewish banking system, the great majority of the money behind the Nazi movement came from German sources and German industries. And so that, I believe, is the case that Carolyn Yeager makes in refuting the blanket claim that Hitler and the Nazis were funded by the Xenosh and that they were nothing but a Xenosh-run controlled opposition, which is a view that I entirely reject. Also, one other comment I'd like to make, referring to the comment on this video, is that, yes, there's a huge problem with the Zads due to the outbreeding of the primary bloodline. So the primary bloodline of the Zads, and it is a racist entity. The Zads are a racial entity. They are Armenoid Turanian Arabs. They're actually a strain of the Arabian block of racial stock. Of Arabian racial stock has many strains. It's a very complicated spectrum. And among these strains, there is one called the Armenoid. And that Armenoid strain, when it linked with the Turanian or Turco-Asiatic strain, created a very virulent people, a very virulent ethnic identity. And then the archontic influence, the archontic infection came into that ethnic identity. So that, to me, is the best picture I can give now, the best picture that I have currently running of what the Zads are in racial terms, okay? The problem is there has been a tremendous amount of interbreeding out of that core racial unit. So the Zads interbreed in two ways. Get this picture really, really clear. They outbreed through the mother line, and they crossbreed through the father line. And then at the same time, they maintain a central line of interbreeding only among themselves. Inbreeding, not interbreeding. So they have the inbred line, and then they have the outbreeding through the mother and the crossbreeding through the father. And this accounts for the fact that the population of Zad hybrids and Xenosh hybrids in the world today is very, very high. You will never be allowed to know what the exact number is, but it's very high. and it's far greater than 2%. This 2% figure is a complete it's a complete lie and misdirection. So yes, the so-called royal families are all characterized by interbreeding with the basic Zadokite bloodlines, which, as I say, goes back to the Armenoid strain of Turano-Arabic peoples from the Middle East. And if you want to know what the Armenoid strain is, I direct you to the work of Arnold Leese, Leese. Talk. So far, so good. If you hear sounds in the background, chair squeaking, I'm actually sitting down for this talk. But I always stand up. I've stood up writing now for 30 years. I wrote the whole course on Gaian alchemy in the 80s, standing up. I wrote Not in His Image, standing up. I delivered the whole G&E, standing up. Well, this afternoon, I'm sitting down in a creaky old chair that I got out of the garbage in Gaucine, Spain, and reconstructed. It's a Swedish design, really comfortable chair. So if some of you out there have any doubts about my grandiosity, I can assure you that the Turton has a throne, and that throne is a piece of Swedish furniture that I salvaged from the garbage. Now, I'm going to be as direct and concise as I can be to go into this subject of MRI, Master Race Ideology. And to do so, I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I use three terms and examine three terms. The first is Herrenvolk, the second is Ubermensch, and then the third I'll leave as a surprise. Now, as far as I know, and I'm happy to be corrected, if you look at the speeches of Adolf Hitler, that is to say, the vocal delivery of the ideology of the National Socialist Workers' Party in Germany, founded by Adolf Hitler, the ideology of the Third Reich, if you will, and if you look at the written propaganda and documents, including the Central Manifesto, The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg, who was German and not Xenosh, even though many Xenosh have names similar to that, and you'll find that typically the word rose appears in assumed names of the Xenosh, such as Geordie Rose. Well, you'll find that the term master race has no actual equivalent in German. There is no evidence of the exact German equivalent of the term master race in the verbal or written material, the verbal or written record of the Nazis. That is a fact. So what term is used? What term did Hitler himself use in addressing the German people and in raising the consciousness of the German people to a new level of their identity, which happened to be also the heroic calling of the German people to save Germany and Europe from a military takeover by the Russian Bolsheviks? What term did Hitler use to address and incite and inspire the people? Well, the term in use was Herrenvolk. And Herrenvolk consists of Volk, meaning folk, and a variation of the German word, spelled in English H-E-R-R, which does not mean master race. It's rather a term of address, as when you say, Herr Schneider. Herr Schneider. What does Herr Schneider mean? It means sir, or it's a term of respect, you say. It means more than anything, it's closer to Mr. than to master. And Mr. is simply a way of giving someone respect or acknowledgement. So when Hitler addressed the German people as the Herrenvolk, and when he called them to their mission, He was simply saying to them, you are the people who deserve respect and who give respect. Respect and honor. Herrenvolk could possibly be translated as the people of honor. That would be closer to its actual meaning in German than master race. You know, you might want to listen to Mark Weber, who gives a talk on the role of Adolf Hitler in history, several talks. And in one of those talks, he explains that it was actually a radio address given by President Roosevelt that established in the mind of the world the notion that Hitler and the Nazis wanted to take over the world. They never wanted to take over the entire world. They did not have a complex of fascist and tyrannical domination that has been attributed to them. That was not operating in the German psyche. So Herrenvolk is a key term to investigate. And I submit to you, and I stand by criticism and correction, sober, polite, and well-based criticism. I stand open to it if I'm wrong on this point. But in my understanding, Herrenvolk is the word, the key word you need to understand to know what kind of racial identity complex was inspiring the German people through their Führer or leader, Adolf Hitler. There's a great bilingual pun in the phoneme, Führer, by the way. Führer in German simply means leader, but it also sounds like Furor, F-U-R-O-R, and there's a long and beautiful story attached to this word, Furor. Okay, now let's move on to the Ubermensch. Now, the Ubermensch is a term introduced into German philosophy and discourse by Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, it so happens that in my teenage years, I was tremendously influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. In some respects, you can say I was put on the course of my mission in life by my encounter with Nietzsche. The preface to Not in His Image, the foreword, the introduction is called The Case for Awe. And in there, I cite two passages from Nietzsche, which electrified me when I was a teenager. So this would be an appropriate moment to review those passages. And here I am reading from Not in His Image. My excitement was so intense upon reading Thus Spake Zarathustra that I had to read some passages of it aloud. I'm with my parents in a car at this time. I started with a section from The Gay Science, which was cited in the introduction to Thus Spake Zarathustra, which contains the famous announcement that God is dead. And then I jumped back to Zarathustra's prologue, quote, I teach you the Superman. Man is something that should be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? The Superman is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say, the Superman shall be the meaning of the earth. I entreat you, my brothers, remain true to the earth, and do not believe those who speak to you of superterrestrial hopes. They are poisoners, whether they know it or not. This is one passage from Thus Spake Zarathustra that I read when I was 16, determined the course of my life. A second passage comes from the section of that same work called On Reading and Writing. As I say in the introduction to Not in His Image, in that passage, I hit upon my personal credo. Quote, you look up when you desire to be exalted, and I look down because I am exalted. Who among you can at the same time laugh and be exalted? Who climbs upon the highest mountains laughs at all tragedies, real or imaginary. Untroubled, scornful, outrageous. That is how wisdom wants us to be. She is a woman who never loves anyone, but a warrior. End quote. Well, at the time I read that, I did not know that the name Sophia from the Gnostic teachings translates into wisdom. I did not know that later on in my life, in my mid-20s, when I encountered the Gnostic materials through theosophy and hermetics and so forth, first indirectly, then later directly, I did not know that the figure of the wisdom goddess Sophia would become the supreme force in my life and in my imagination and the supreme focus of my desire and passion, and that I would find my mission as a warrior in the cause of Sophia, if you will. But there it is, as clear as day. Nietzsche himself, in some way, was inspired by the presence of the wisdom goddess, and he equated the wisdom of Gnosis with the role of the warrior. And I've spoken of this many times. The warrior, the Gnostic, and the shaman. Those are the three roles that combine in planetary Tantra. There you find your identity. There you find your mission, as I found my mission. Now, I'm not going to go into any commentary about Nietzsche's concept of the Ubermensch and how it came to be adapted or adopted by the Nazis. This is a very difficult and prickly, complicated subject. It's a minefield of pit holes and potholes and explosions of association, some of which may be correct and others are not correct. So I'm not going to even comment on how the ideology of the Third Reich incorporated Nietzsche's concept of the Ubermensch. I will simply point out that as far as I know, Goebbels, Hitler, and others did not directly cite Nietzsche in their public speeches. They did not necessarily incorporate the Nietzschean Superman. Now, you will hear hundreds of scholars, literally hundreds of scholars and historians, repeating each other to claim that the entity of the Nietzschean Übermensch informed the master race ideology of the Nazis. Well, I can't refute that by evidence right now, but I'm telling you that is a distorted and warped interpretation, and handle it with care. If you want to research this subject, then read the biography of Nietzsche by Walter Kaufmann. Be aware that although Walter Kaufmann was a great humanist and an existential philosopher, Walter Kaufmann had Xenosh origins. Now, Walter Kaufmann was a great teacher of mine. I never knew him personally, but his works have inspired me and given me guidance all through my life. Now, one has to be very careful here, because you know about hidden agendas and bias and the hidden spin that occurs in all interpretations of history and philosophy. So I cannot give Walter Kaufmann an absolutely 100% clearance. I haven't vetted him carefully enough, but I can tell you that his scholarship is impeccable. And if you're going to read any book about Nietzsche and learn about Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, then read Walter Kaufmann's book first. That would be Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist, published by the Princeton University Press in 1954. Okay, sliding past the Übermensch, now I'll take you to the third term, the third key word. And I can pretty much guarantee you, amazingly, you would probably be amazed by this fact, but I can pretty much guarantee you that you've never heard this word before. And yet the discussion of the entire field of topics that I'm covering here, historical, philosophical, ideological, so forth and so on, the discussion of this topic is incomplete without this term. It is the most proper and direct term for addressing the Zadakim in terms of their ideology of domination It's the most correct, concise, and proper term for understanding how the Zadakim view themselves. They view themselves as what? Do they view themselves as the Herrenvolk? No, they don't. The Zadakim, in their self-promotional ideology, in the whole scheme of ideas that drives their agenda of world domination and enslavement of the Rome or the Goyim, do not regard themselves as the people of honor. And they certainly do not exhibit the quality of respect, which is essential to their Herrenvolk. Who do the Zadakim respect? Do they respect anyone who is not Xenosh? No. And do they have the respect of the rest of the world? Yeah, they command the respect of the rest of the world. And if you don't give it to them, there's a chance that they will kill you. They are really easily offended if you don't honor them as the chosen race that is superior to all others. So they do not consider themselves to be the Herrenvolk, nor do they consider themselves to be the Ubermensch. In fact, just want to throw something in here without going into a digression. About, 6, 7 years ago, this clip came up on the internet, and it was titled, "What the Jews mean when they say Goyim." And you can't find this clip anywhere now, but I think there is a small extract of it that has been saved. It's been scrubbed from the internet. This clip came from a series of talks given by a woman named Dotan, D-O-T-A-N. As far as I can know, Dotan was of Irish ethnic origin. She was of the white races, as far as I know. Anyway, she ends up in Israel. She's married to a Talmudic rabbi. And she opens up this talk by saying, "I'm going to tell you something now that I'm not supposed to tell you." Interesting introduction, right? "I'm going to tell you something now that we among us, our elite group of Talmudic rabbis," including her husband, who was her handler, "only say among ourselves. But I'm going to tell you this." How this happened, I don't know, but one thing you may have observed is that the Xenosh, in their arrogance and in their chutzpah, have a tendency to out themselves from time to time. So what Dotan said, I'll give you a paraphrase because this is a close quote. I'll never forget it. She said, "We," meaning the Xenosh, "are the children of the Most High, and you are not. You Goyim. You are our children. And this is a hard thing for you to accept, but you better get over it." This is what she actually said. She actually said that the Xenosh, at the highest circle or the innermost circle of their ideological core, do not even consider themselves to be of the human race. They are not mentioned. They are Elohim. They are a godly, angelic race, and presumably the Goyim are their creation, their progeny. So there you have it. This is the bizarre conception, megalomaniac grandiosity coming through Doreen Dotan. I call that the self-concept of humanity. You find talks that I've given, the end of humanity. Humanity is the self-identification of that faction of humanity that defines itself as above and beyond humanity. Hence, Xenosh, which is a word based on the root xeno or xeno, meaning alien or apart. Well, it's not my definition. Apparently, that is how they define themselves. And that being so, you cannot say that the Xenosh, with their core ideology rooted in the Zadakim, would be Ubermensch. They are not mensch. So how can they be Ubermensch? Cross off Ubermensch. So, what the fuck are they? by their own ultimate definition. What is that secret word that you haven't heard before? That word by which they not only define themselves, but they are also defined by those who are in their service and who choose to be or are persuaded to be agents of their agenda of MRI, Master Race Ideology. Well, let's go back to the Gnostic investigation of the Mandela effect. I said in the beginning of that investigation that the human probative faculty, who comes up as Snoopy in the Peanuts cartoons, which are cued by Mandela effects, the probative faculty is damaged in the human species. Nevertheless, without using the probative faculty to examine evidence and build evidence into a chain of proof, you can never arrive at the truth about anything. So, following my own standard, I will take you now to the evidence that provides the disclosure of this term. So here I am sitting in my piece of Swedish junk furniture, which is a beautiful artifact of design and comfort, and I happen to be reading an old newspaper. And this newspaper is dated November 8th, 1899. Okay? And the actual source of the article is a German publication, the Munich Latest News. Okay? The Münchner Neueste Nachrichten. Okay? Now, the topic of this, it's kind of an op-ed. It's a commentary. The article contains a statement of some facts, and it contains commentary by a particular individual who shall be named. And to give you a little background, what was going on here in November of 1899 was a legal case. Now, today, given the internet, given the planet-wide network of communication today, the mainstream media, even the mainstream media will pick up a legal case. And that legal case will be some incident that happened in some particular place. For example, the shooting of Michael Brown, a black man, by a policeman, was a legal case. It was an incident and a legal case that ignited the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and it was known all around the world. Well, it's remarkable to reflect that more than a century before it was possible for such instances to be known to the entire world overnight, there were certain cases that were discussed almost worldwide at the time. And this is one case. In fact, there were about, I could cite for you 6 or 7 cases that occurred in Europe, in Eastern Europe, from the 17th century coming forward, that were subject to enormous interest around the world, not in every corner of the world, obviously, as today, but wherever newspapers were printed, there was a kind of international press existing, and lo and behold, some of these news items were known to the entire world. And this particular story concerns the murder of Marie Klima. Marie Klima was found, her body was found in July of 1899 in a place called Polna, which I believe is in Bohemia in Eastern Europe. And her corpse became the subject of a murder investigation. You may not realize it. Many people would be surprised, I think, today to know that murder investigations and forensic investigations of certain kinds were undertaken with great care in the past, and they were extensively and carefully executed. So forensics today, criminal forensics, is of course a big deal, but in the past, when it was necessary, when certain people deemed it necessary to solve a certain crime, when that crime, because of its particular nature, cried out to human conscience, well, the individuals who took it upon themselves to do so exerted tremendous efforts. And there is an impressive record of testimony, circumstantial evidence, witness evidence, and forensics around these particular cases, which all concern the same crime, as if there was a serial crime being investigated. And the death or murder of Marie Klima was one in a series of serial murders of a particular kind. So, it so happens, getting back to the Munich newspaper article of the 8th of November, 1899, it so happens that the conditions around this murder were hotly debated in the European press and to a certain extent in the international press of that time. Finally, before I cite the text of the article directly, let me point out that in these cases of this particular kind of murder, there was also a lot of public debate about corruption, about slander, about false accusations. In other words, the subject was incendiary, and it ignited arguments and debates in newspapers, and this quotation is from one of those debates. Now, there was an individual at that time. His name was Thomas Garrigue Masaryk, Masaryk. And he was of half Xenosh ethnic origins, that is to say, he was a hybrid or crossbreed from the Xenosh racial strain. And he was a professor, had been a professor at Prague Academy, and he was a political figure in the Czech People's Party, which is a significant detail that comes up again later on. During his student years, he'd lived in Vienna and lodged at Leopoldstadt, which was primarily a quarter of the city inhabited by the Xenosh. And he had become a familiar person and a tutor to certain families of that ethnic strain. So it turns out that in the incendiary debate that was going on around the trial of Leopold Hilsner, who was a vagabond Jew accused of murdering Marie Klima, he was deemed as a person whose voice and reputation qualified him to speak not only in defense of the accused, a Jewish vagabond, but in defense of the Jewish people. Because in the debate over this crime, one of the issues that ignited public interest was, this particular ethnic group is being accused of doing something routinely and repeatedly. And is this accusation based on fact or evidence, or is it merely a hate crime directed against these innocent people? This is a huge issue. That is the issue under debate in the article I'm citing. So Masaryk took on the case to defend not only the accused, but the ethnic group from whom that accused came. And he analyzed the Pollner murder in a brochure, which was cited in this newspaper. And in the brochure, it says, the author, Masaryk, says that he is coming forth to take the cause of the accused, quote, to make up for the disgrace which the Czech press has brought upon Bohemia and Austria by its acceptance of a ritual murder, end quote. So in other words, get the argument here, get the spin. Where Masaryk is coming from, he's saying, well, I'm going to step in here because our region of the country has been contaminated by the acceptance of a ritual murder. What does that mean? It means that the case raised the occasion in the public mind to consider the taboo subject of JRM, or Jewish ritual murder. And whenever that comes up, whenever that occasion comes up, or that accusation comes up, it is called the accusation of blood libel. And the blood libel against the Xenosh is a really, really big issue in the history of this planet. Much bigger than you might ever have imagined. There are massive historical events that have taken place around the controversy of blood libel, and this is one of them. This is one case which I'm inviting you to examine microscopically. So, Masaryk wrote, and I quote, "I admitted openly that the condemnation of Hilsner has affected me deeply. Me, who feels a warm affinity and love for the Übervolk of the Jews, which continually distinguishes itself from other peoples by its high ethics. But there are charges, witnesses, judges, and doctors who have fallen victim to the suggestion of ritual murder. Even if Hilsner had committed the murder, which I will never believe, this is still far from being a ritual murder, but rather an act of self-defense. The spontaneous explosion of that accumulated suffering and of that torment which had been done to the Jewish people in the cruelest manner for centuries," end quote. I invite you to savor that passage. You might want to sit back and have a cup of coffee. You might want to smoke a Cuban cigar. You might want to have a stiff shot of bourbon. Or you might, as I sometimes do, want to mix yourself a Stoli screwdriver, and I'm talking about a tall one at that. What you have in these words, which could be fitted into a tweet, I believe, that's how concise they are, is the juxtaposition of two momentous concepts. One is the true name of the proponents of master race ideology. They are the Übervolk, and that's a name you've never seen before. Yet here is someone who is a champion of the Übervolk, citing them by the name that they themselves assume, citing them by the name that designates their self-defined role relative to the rest of humanity. They are the Übervolk. And in addition to outing this term, Masaryk goes on to say, get this, do you get what he says? He says, even if there was a murder, well, it could not have been a ritual murder because that's blood libel against the Jews, and everyone knows that blood libel against the Jews has no basis whatsoever in evidence. It's merely a hateful projection upon blameless people. But, and it gets so much better, doesn't it? Even if the Jewish vagabond Hilsner had murdered and ritually mutilated the body of Marie Klima, well, it was an act of self-defense. The spontaneous explosion of that accumulated suffering, of that torment, which has been done to the Jewish people in the cruelest manner for centuries. How do you like that? How does that statement sit on your stomach? So there you have it. The Übervolk identity has been disclosed. And along with the Übervolk identity, there is a rationale, isn't there? There is an excuse. for any possible harm that that innocent ethnic group might commit upon the Goyim. And of course, the idea of systematic serial ritual murders is out of the question. But any slight harm they might commit upon the Goyim is totally acceptable as an act of response to the way that they have been treated. That is the mentality of the Übervolk. And you won't find a serial killer, either a real live one like Ted Bundy or a fictional one like Hannibal Lecter, who has a rationale of behavior as evil as that. That says it all. So on that note, I'm going to conclude this talk as I'm making these segments a little shorter, and I'm just at 50 minutes. And I'll pick up the inferences and the extrapolations that I would like to draw from this profile of the Übervolk in my next upload. Until then, heed the obvious and hold to correction. There's your best chance for a future worth living.